Okay, cool.
All right. All right. Well, we're on. Andy, really glad you're able to join today. Today we have Dr. Andrew Witt. It's very strange calling you that, man. Uh, we went to seminary together. You were doing your doctorate at Wycliffe College. You are now a professor with Tyndale. You teach Old Testament and Hebrew.
Hmm.
So today, Andy, just so thankful you're able to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the Psalms and sort of our present situation with the COVID virus.
Hmm.
So, just sort of kicking us off, Andy, what can you tell us, sort of to the average consumer or listener,
Yeah.
what they need to know about the Book of Psalms?
Well, big broad question, right? So, if you don't know what the Psalms are, the most basic thing is so Psalms are a part of the Old Testament, and so it's this book of 150 prayers or songs that come out of ancient Israel, connected to King David, and then some of the priests, the Levitical priests that were part of kind of his temple plans. So kind of the plans he put in place to kind of run the temple. A lot of the Levites were associated with music as well. So the Psalms come out of David and these Levites, and kind of move through history. And so we have this kind of really big range of spirituality from the Old Testament, starting around 1000 BC with David, going all the way through to something like Psalm 137, which is, by the rivers of Babylon, I wept, right? So this is happening during Israel's exile, which is around like 550 BC, right? So that it's almost 500 years of prayers and songs that are included in the book of Psalms. Um, but in the New Testament, they're also associated with prophecy connected to Jesus as well. Um, so like Jesus on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Right? He's quoting Psalm 22, the first verse there.
So,
So there's this
can
big
I interrupt for a
range.
second here? Is
Sure.
there any relationship then? Why are there, you said there are 150 of them, why are they in the order they're in? So
Yeah.
presumably one isn't written before 150 necessarily, or how did
Right.
that all happen?
Um, that's a good question. Yeah. So this is something that I'm actually part of this bigger conversation in the academic world about what the arrangement of the Psalms is, because oftentimes the Psalms are talked about as kind of like the hymn book of ancient Israel. Um, so on kind of analogy with that, like we have our hymn books that we use in church, right? And
Mhm.
right, we have a certain arrangement with them, right? We put all of the Psalms dealing with God's providence in the same spot, or dealing with creation and nature in the same spot,
Yeah.
or we put all the Easter ones together, and so we have kind of a particular arrangement that we do. But in the Old Testament, it's not as easy to figure out what that arrangement is, and there's a few things that help us.
Mhm.
So oftentimes we consider Psalms 1 and 2 at the very beginning to be a kind of an introduction to the book. So they would kind of they introduce you to who are the main characters you're going to hear from, what kinds of themes are we going to talk about here, dealing with the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked,
So when
or
you talk about
yeah,
these themes and these characters, do they
yeah,
last throughout then the entire book of Psalms? Or
they
do you
do,
mean like
yeah.
they're for a section of it?
They last throughout the whole book, yeah. So what's kind of interesting is when you get to the end, you have all these. So from like Psalm 146 all the way to 150 would be kind of like the Hallelujah section of our hymn book, where it's everything's kind of leading up to this final exclamation of praise at the end.
Okay.
And we hear from all the same characters that we do in those first two psalms, and so they're there throughout the whole thing. But kind of mapping out where you're getting led to along the way is a bit more tricky. But there is a certain order there that you're moving to this place of praise by the
Yeah.
time you get to the end of the book. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. So why is it such a big book? Why are there 150? Why aren't there 50? Why aren't there 174?
Um, that is a really hard question too. Um, So part of it, I think, is we could ask the same question for a lot of different books, right? Like, why does Matthew have 28 chapters, or why does John have 21,
But,
right?
but in the case of
Yeah,
Matthew, right? The
yeah,
book of Matthew is the book of Matthew. And so, there's that old joke about how verses and chapters got put in the Bible was it was a drunk monk on horseback. And he was just sort of putting in numbers.
yeah,
But Psalms, each Psalm is an individual Psalm. So
yeah.
if I write a piece of poetry, why isn't it Psalm 151? You
That's
see
true.
what I'm
That's a good
asking?
question. Yeah, I think well, part of it has to do with the importance of worship in the Old Testament, and so I mean, it is the longest book in the Bible, not just because it has 150 chapters, but if you actually break down how many words are there and that kind of thing, it's definitely the longest book in the Bible. And so part of it, I think, has to do with the importance of worship, but at the same time, I think the length, like kind of the history of the book itself. And so I think early on in Christianity, you had this idea that maybe David wrote the entire book of Psalms,
Oh,
but even then it was debated. And I think nowadays they kind of moved to this idea that it started with David, right? So there's Psalms that can definitely go back to David, but the book as a whole didn't really come to completion until around 500 or even 400 BC. And so you do have these 500 or 600 years of history where certain blocks of Psalms are added to the end. So you have like the Psalms of Ascent would be a good one. So from like Psalm 120 to 134, if you look at the titles to those Psalms that are in the Bible, they all start with a Psalm of Ascent or something like that.
hmm.
But they're all kind of held together as this 15 Psalm block. And so at some point in the history of the book, those 15 got thrown in where they are to be called 120 to 134. And so I think it's just this long period of time. And you do tend to see, like, if there is a progression of ideas in the Psalms, it goes
Mhm.
from, right, you have David at the beginning, where, if you look from Psalm like 3 all the way to Psalm 72, you have kind of the life of David within that chunk of Psalms. And so, but with Psalm 72, at the beginning of that one, it's of Solomon. So here's our first introduction to David's son. And then you get to Psalm 89, where it looks like the book is lamenting the end of the monarchy. So it's probably around the time of the exile. And then from, we call it book 4 in the book of Psalms, but Psalm 90 to 106 have a lot of themes that do with exile. Whereas, after that point from 107 on, there is this idea of people maybe still being in exile, but the exile's in a way over, and people can now return and worship again at the temple. And so it does seem to progress through history, but things are definitely not in chronological order all the way through. Yeah, it's really, yeah.
With them not being in chronicle order, like
Yeah.
if I were to pick up the Gospel of Matthew, obviously I read chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
How do I read the book of Psalms then?
Yeah, well, the way that I talk about it is to think about the psalm as kind of a word picture, if you want to put it that way. So,
Okay.
um, so one of the things that Hebrew does with poetry is it likes to put things in parallelism, and so
Well,
parallelism
explain.
is this
Yeah.
thing um, where, so in English, like when we think about poetry, we think about things rhyming, right? Roses are red, violets are blue, right? And we're gonna keep going with that, right? So you have like, you try to rhyme different lines, so you have this kind of the same sound at the end of different lines. But in Hebrew, it's more of um, a rhyming of ideas, is the way that I talk about it. So you
Okay.
have one line, and you don't care about rhyming at all, but you care about like the next line, you'll have the same idea or maybe the opposite idea um, stated. So these kind of, you're like working with 2 lines at a time,
Yeah.
or maybe sometimes 3 lines at a time. Um, and so I think that kind of moves out as well. So when you're reading something like Psalm 3 and you move into Psalm 4, you'll see like, oh, there's a lot going on that's very similar between the two of these. And so, so the terminology that I use to talk about this is you're kind of moving forward in the book in chunks. So like you'll take, so for example, I think Psalm 3, 4, 5, and 6 work together as a good little chunk of Psalms. And so, um, so you kind of read one and you can read one by itself and it's fine. But then you read the other one, it's not like you're moving forward in time or something like that, but you're reflecting on the same theme from a different angle. So
Okay.
it's kind of like in music when they talk about like variations on a theme or something like that. So um, you're yeah, you're kind of approaching the same idea, but from all these different angles, kind of looking at it. And so in that way, you're moving through the book, but you're not necessarily moving through time, as it were.
Yeah, you're listening
Yeah.
to it from a different angle then, trying to grow deeper in that same topic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Um, are there, when you look then at the topics or the themes of the Book of Psalms, what seems to come up most frequently?
Um, well, something that's kind of surprising, I think, um, and it actually fits pretty well for where we are now, I think, is this theme of God being hidden from you.
Hmm.
And because a lot of the Psalms, especially the first half of the book, deal with this theme of lament. And so it's getting into, when I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but when life sucks, when bad things are happening,
It
when
does, and it's true.
it's
Sometimes it
true,
happens. Yeah.
and like when things seem to be falling apart,
Yep.
or when, I mean, if you look at the Psalms, there's all these situations where people have been falsely accused of things,
Oh yeah.
or you're dealing with terminal illness, or you're dealing with betrayal of friends or someone dying. Like there's all these themes that are really there in the Psalms. And often what you'll find is when people pray about this, they'll pray that God does not seem to be there. It's
Mm.
really strange. And um, but there's this kind of mystery of God's hiddenness in the midst of the Psalms to me that really stands out. And it doesn't cause people to give up hope, but it calls people to remember the times when God has not been hidden, right? And you're relying on how God has revealed himself already to you. And so the Psalms have this really cool way of um, having you reflect on the past and bring that into a present that's kind of uncertain, to give you hope for the future. And so that's something that stands out quite a lot to me when I'm reading the Psalms.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So if I'm going through something in my life and the books have these different themes or topics, how do I find something that connects to me? How do I find sort of that wisdom, that truth, that encouragement in the Psalms
Hmm.
if I've never studied them? If I'm going
Yeah.
through a hopeless time, where do I look?
Well, the good thing is they're everywhere. So, um, so I think I would just say just pick it up and start reading it. I think the coolest thing about them is you don't need a PhD to understand them. I think one of the reasons why they've been such an important part of both Jewish and Christian spirituality since the beginning that we know is that there's something about the Psalms that are just easy to connect with.
Yeah.
And um, I mean, some of the language for sure we get uncomfortable with as Christians, right? Like smite my enemies and all this kind of thing, right? And that's a whole other discussion we would have to talk about that one. But there's not as much of that as you would think. And I think when you're just working through, it's really easy to come at these as a novice and just come and read and pray. And and I would say look for places in the Psalms that seem to imply that God has promised something,
Mm.
and take a note of that. And I think by the time you get to like Psalm 20 and Psalm 30, Psalm 40, you'll begin to see there's a lot of patterns that are happening in the Psalms that you can just, whatever your educational background is, and even if you're reading a more paraphrased translation, it still comes through. And um, so pick up your Bible and just start working your way through. And they don't take long. And so even if you do, I think some of the reading plans that I've seen go like 5 Psalms a day. So it'll take you a month to get through the whole book. But 5 Psalms a day, it should take you about 20 minutes a day at the
Yeah.
most to
Does
read
Psalm
through them.
119 get its own chapter though, like its own day? Or do I have to read
Yeah.
that one and 4
I
others?
know. Yeah. So maybe take that one as its own day. I
Okay.
think, yeah, Psalm 119, if you don't know, if you're watching this, right, it has like 170 verses,
Yeah.
something like that. And I think by itself, it takes about 35 minutes to read.
Yeah.
It's a long read. Yeah.
But yeah, it's a little more to chew on than the others. I think Psalm,
Yes.
what is it, 117 is the shortest, which is like, praise God.
Yeah,
It's like,
exactly.
sweet.
So they balance it out a bit, right? The shortest one right next to the biggest one.
I think that's pretty awesome. So for people watching this, like obviously the book of Psalms is a great book to read. It relates to what people are going through. So although you might have like the law of the Old Testament, which is like this is what God says do and don't to the people of Israel, and you
Hmm.
get like the Gospels of Jesus, and his life and why this is good news, and you get the epistles of the early church and how it's growing. What does the book of Psalms mean to the Christian today? Where does it fit in our theology?
Yeah, a great question. So I think the way I would put it is the unique thing about the Psalms is how it talks about you as a person. And um, going back to pretty early in church history, so around like 300, 400 AD, there was this Christian priest and bishop named Athanasius. And he's a pretty popular or pretty well-known theologian, but he wrote this really great little letter. You can find it online if you search for it, called the Letter of Marcellinus. And so it's basically this monk that was kind of starting into becoming a monk, and he wanted some advice on how do you read the Psalms. And it's one of my favorite little letters that is there in church history. And basically what Athanasius says is the Psalms have this unique ability of um, kind of being a mirror to you. So when you're reading them, it's like looking into a mirror. So and what you see are kind of the hard realities about who you are.
Hmm.
Things that you don't normally consider about what's going on inside your heart or in your mind. And it puts those things into voice. And so it's kind of, what's the way to put it? I mean, he called it a mirror of the soul, but it's this, John Calvin would later call it the anatomy of the soul. And so
Okay.
it's a way of kind of, um, no other book of the Bible does this, where it shows you kind of all of your emotions, all of these things that these masters of spirituality thought about in ancient Israel. And so as you want to kind of grow as a Christian, the Psalms can help you to kind of point out things about yourself that you would have never thought about by reading any other book of the Bible. And so I think that's one of the big values here is, sometimes we don't know what to pray, right? And we'll, I think our default is probably the Lord's Prayer, right? The Our
Oh
Father.
yeah.
Um, but even then, like, we've said this forever, and so we memorize it. And and so, if you're kind of more spontaneous kind of prayer, you'll use it more of as an outline instead of as, I'm just going to pray these 10 lines and I'm done, right?
Mm.
You'll, hallowed be your name, and then you can move into saying other ways in which you consider God's name to be holy or something like that. And I think the Psalms work that same way, where it's, you need to get familiar with them. And when you do, you learn things about yourself and how to pray about certain things that might come up in your life. And it gets that pattern into your mind on how to think through prayer. And so it'll give you kind of a template eventually on how to, if I'm sick, I can go to, what is it? Psalm 38, I think, is the sixth Psalm. So I can go to Psalm 38 and learn like, oh, here's how the psalmist prayed when like deathly ill. It's like, maybe I can learn something about myself and about how do I put into words what I'm feeling at this moment. And so the psalmist can do that for you, which is great, which might spark other ways that you learn how to pray as well. So
That's
um,
pretty amazing. Like
yeah,
to use the Psalms as this template. And you talked a little bit earlier. I found it really encouraging by your statement about here are some of these masters of faith of belief walking with God, and here
yeah,
they are talking about going through struggle. Where's God? Where's God in this moment? And
yeah,
that's sort of encouraging to me to hear that, because I think of all the times where I've struggled in my faith and in my walk, and things are happening around me, and me going, God, where are you in this moment? I
right,
believe in you.
yeah,
What are you doing? Are you
yeah,
taking a nap? Like, what's going on? And I know in my head, like theologically, I don't believe God's taking a nap, but it doesn't help me in that moment, in that now of I'm in pain.
yeah,
Where's the one who says he loves me? Why isn't he here?
yeah. Oh, that's definitely true. And so I think, and part of that I think is faith building as well. That
Mm,
um, you know, even if we don't see God's hand explicitly at work in whatever this is at the moment, we trust that it is, right?
yeah,
Even if we can't quite comprehend it, we still want to know, and that's a good thing.
yeah,
And God is happy to hear us longing to know that thing, right? Um, and so yeah, and so I think that's part of like the charm of even lament is that um, I don't know, like I think when I first became a Christian, you hear all these like I heard all these promises on what life would be like after being a Christian, where it's like God's gonna fix all your problems and this or this or this,
yeah,
and then
yeah,
exactly, yeah. When as soon as like maybe for the first 6 months I was like, yeah, things are getting better, but then yeah, things got crappy again, right? And
yeah,
and not everything goes according to plan, and
yeah.
tragedies happen, and so these kind of promises that people made seem to get dashed. And so when you get to church, sometimes that praise song isn't that helpful at the moment. And what's I think cool about the Psalms and Lament is you're not just given permission to ask God questions and to it's not doubt. I don't think it's doubt to ask questions. It's part of your faith. But you're not just given permission to do that, but I think the Psalms expect you to do that, right? And to voice those concerns, those longings, the troubles you're
Yeah.
having, and just to name them.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but that seems like a very different way of approaching God than I was always sort of encouraged.
Yeah.
I was always encouraged to approach God with the sense of He is perfect, He is holy, He is awesome, and so you shouldn't question Him. You
Yeah.
should just accept that He is doing good at work, doing good things,
Yeah.
and so don't question, just trust that He is.
Yeah.
And
Just
at some point in time, you'll understand.
yeah. Just put your head down and keep going, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And but that's not the picture you get at all. And I think like the book of Hebrews helps here too, I think a little bit when we hear about like Jesus being the high priest that's on this throne of grace who's ready to help us in our time
yeah.
of need. Like that's exactly the picture we get from the Psalms that yeah, God is ready to be there to help, and he's listening. So pray
Mhm.
away and don't be afraid to hold back, I think is a thing. And
That's
yeah, the Psalms just like open it up so that most things are appropriate.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And it seems like if you can question, you said earlier, can I say the word sucks?
yeah.
I don't know if you can or can't. Uh, but
But now we've both said it, so
but now we both, there you go. I don't know if that's good or bad. But the thing about it, though, is that it feels like if the Psalms, if these great religious leaders, these great men and women of faith are saying these things, then it gives permission for me to say them. It gives
Mhm.
permission for the average person to encounter those same feelings and those same experiences and still call themselves a believer.
Oh
And
yeah,
they'll
yeah,
say, you know what? I can have a rubbish day, just a day that sucks.
yeah.
And at the same time, I can, after that day, still look faithfully in the mirror and say confidently, I'm a Christian. I'm still
Mhm.
a believer, even though I had that rubbish day.
Yeah.
Even though I had a day where I questioned God, where were you?
Hmm.
It doesn't mean I've lost my faith.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's so important because I think the only way we really think about worship is praise. Like praise is worship. But I think what's kind of neat, like the word for psalm in Hebrew is this word mizmor, which means, I mean, we usually translate it as like a psalm of David or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But it's really kind of a holy song of David is what it's really talking about. And so whether the Psalms are this hallelujah chorus of praise or this really deep, troubling lament of some kind of situation, they're all sacred songs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think you would categorize them all as worship. And so even when you're coming to God, I think with this heart of trying to figure things out and not being sure and being frustrated,
Yeah.
that you can still be approaching God in a place of worship there. And I think that's really freeing um, for your spiritual life to be able to do that.
I think that's
Yeah.
yeah, amazing. The Because I think to Psalm 51, right? And I think of this repentance and this pain
Hmm.
that David's going through, and this horror that he's experienced, and the betrayal he's felt towards realizing what he's done, and how he has obviously hurt this person who worked for him, who is his servant, as he's king. Everybody is his servant,
Yeah.
but the one he truly does love is God. And
Hmm.
this realization of that he has betrayed God and he hurt the one that he loves,
Hmm.
and that realization. And so I read that psalm, and I in honesty, I read it going, I don't really feel I actually understand.
Yeah.
I haven't experienced it. I don't really feel I can understand. So
Yeah.
sometimes I read Psalm 51, and I start to wonder, is there a psalm of like first world problems? Like, I stubbed my toe twice today. Ouch. My day is horrible and awful. The pants I
Well, I
wanted
think
to wear
like,
are in the dirty pile. Like, is there a first world problem psalm?
well, I think like, I mean, ancient Israel was a first world place, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So like, I think these themes of like betrayal and, I mean, some of the six psalms are hard for us because I think in the first world we, sorry, I misspoke earlier. So it was ancient Israel was a third world. Sorry. Um, but like, yeah, you're asking about first world problems. But I think like the hard thing is um, we're prevented from so many things, right? Like being sick, we can usually just go and get some kind of medicine, and 3 or 4 days later, it's fine, right? And the things that would have killed us 100 years ago, like we have vaccines for those and stuff
Yeah.
like that, right? So like, so I think like one of the interesting things about how things are now with the pandemic and all that is
Mm-hmm.
we're confronted again with the fragility of who we are, and it's a scary place, right? Like to know like, oh, if I go to the store and I don't wear a face mask, or if I just hug a friend, that could kill me, right? Like that's terrifying,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
It's a complete different world shift for sure.
yeah, it really is. And it's very uncomfortable for a lot of us, right? And I think rightly so. And um so in some ways I think the Psalms uh can gain more meaning here in kind of our context because we can more easily connect with them. Um, but I think like one way that I try to connect this to an experience that I might not be feeling, right, is to think through. I mean, one of the questions that I looked at in my dissertation was this question on who speaks when we read the Psalms, right? So we're reading through, what voice do we hear when we're praying this? Are we meant to hear David praying this or Jesus praying this? Maybe it's me. I'm just supposed to put this on my lips and pray it.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the options that we don't normally think about is kind of the church as a collective body praying this psalm. And what's neat about doing that is you begin to think outside of your own, little isolated island that you live on, to think about, okay, well, what are some things that the church is going through in the city, in the country? How about in the Middle East, where, you know, Christians are still being beheaded? Or
Yeah.
what about in China, where Christians still need to meet underground? Or North Korea? Like, maybe I can pray this psalm for them as well, right? And so it begins to kind of open up some really cool avenues for thinking how you can pray for the church at large. And I
So
found that helpful too.
it sounds like you're saying earlier that the Psalms can be used like as a blueprint to create your own prayers,
Hmm.
but also really it's a blueprint or an inspiration for intercession as well.
Oh, for
So
sure.
this prayer sure might have been written by a person who's long dead, but this prayer can equally be the voice of the church today. And so I can be praying for, looking at this, it can inspire me to pray regarding what's going on in my own life, but also regarding what's going on in Christians around the world, what their lives are like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, if looking at this, then you talk about them being a blueprint. Is there anything that, any way that we might be able to become better, or do you have any suggestions or references that we could sort of grab a hold of to be able to be better at that?
Yeah, I think, well, one of them is you probably already have it at home, your BCP. So I think, like, what's kind of cool is if you flip to the back of that, you'll find the Psalter there, and you'll find it's kind of set up for kind of a prayer session already, and it breaks it down into different ways to read it and to get through it in a certain amount of time. Um, so you have, like, the very basics on how to do that there.
Mm-hmm.
You just open it up and do it. um, but I think there's some good resources that are available. Uh, and David, I know I sent you one of these already. I don't know if you
Yeah.
want to bring it up. Um, but there's this Old Testament, well, he's kind of a theologian, spiritual advisor. You've probably heard of him before, Eugene Peterson. He's probably most famous for creating, or I guess translating, the Message Bible,
Mm-hmm.
which, I mean, depending on what circles you run in, it gets a lot of flack for not being the best translation. Um, but for the most part, it's pretty good. He captures a lot of the ideas that are there, and but he's written a bunch of devotional material as well that he's not as well known for. But it's like gold. It's so good. And so this is the book that's up here on the screen, is one that, if I have friends that ask me, what should I tell my congregation to read? I'm like, this book. So even though it's 30 years old, it's still very relevant, and it's a great, incredible, um, just kind of brief look at some aspects of reading the Psalms. And like the title says, it's a perfect title for the book, Answering God, the Psalms as a Tool for Prayer. And so it kind of walks through in more detail the kinds of things that we were talking about
Mm-hmm.
earlier. But I would definitely recommend that one. Um, so that's good. And for the most part, if you have a study Bible that has notes on the Book of Psalms,
Yeah.
I think for the most part, those are pretty good. And so just kind of work your way through, and you'll do a better job with them than you think you would do. So I always encourage people that, these texts weren't written for academics, right? They were written for normal people.
Yeah.
And so, we look at a lot of different details and all that kinds of stuff. But one of my favorite profs I had in seminary always just talked about the best reader of the Bible is the one that just reads it over and over and over again. And so I think that's the same thing true with the Psalms. Is if you want to learn how to do it, just do it. They're very forgiving on.
That's awesome. That's awesome
working.
advice.
Yeah.
I had a teacher once who said, what would you say, or what should you say to somebody when they talk about encountering a part of the Bible they don't know?
Hmm.
And I was like, oh, I don't know, study or anything. He goes, no, don't say any of that. He says, what you tell them to do is read faster. And I said, what? You're going to understand less. He goes, yes, but you're going to get sooner to a place where you do understand, and then they'll be good again. I was like, oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah. And well, it's definitely true. And I think you'd be surprised, like if you just take a note on where you would read faster, the next time you come around to that, you might be like, oh, now that I know more,
Yeah.
This makes a bit more sense to me. Or so I think you'd be able to track your growth in that too. So yeah,
For
I think
sure.
that's a good tip.
All right. Well, Andy, I just want to say thanks so much for everything, for having a chat today.
Yeah.
You know what? It's really great to hear of what you're doing over at Tyndale and what the students there are all learning.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, with this given situation, classes are a little bit differently
Yeah.
done.
They're interesting. Yeah.
But I'm sure they're all in good hands, it sounds like. So that's wonderful.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah.
Say thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, everybody, I just encourage you to keep an eye out for these, for the books that Andy has suggested here by Eugene Peterson, Answering God, as well as encouragement, as always, just to keep reading and studying the scriptures and praying that God would open those to you, because that's where we encounter him.
Amen. Yeah.
All right. Well, God bless, and thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Yep. See ya.